in a so-called democracy to suspend the democratic process, such as parliamentarians discussing or voting on an issue?
Well, what we just heard is that apparently that what the Prime Minister and the Queen have done is above the law. Well, of course it isn't above the law. The Queen effectively is the law, and she has had a good look at this and said, well, this is fine. What we've got is a sort of sandwich here with Parliament in the middle. On one side of the sandwich is the Queen, the sovereign, president in most countries, but we have a monarchy. And on the other side is the people who voted in a democratic referendum, not absolutely overwhelmingly, but decisively to leave the EU. These protests we've seen today, by the way, tens of thousands, no, sorry, it was only 400 marching through London today to Buckingham Palace. Nevertheless, it gets the top billing on the BBC News. We often get tens of thousands turn out in London, sometimes for protests, which isn't even covered by the BBC. So the mass media is playing a big part here in trying to over-egg the pudding for the Remainers, the people who lost the democratic vote and are now trying very hard to find any excuse to stop Brexit.
Tony, what about what Ian has just said, Tony? That it's not even, for example, today it's not even about the demonstrations so much as far as Brexit or Remain or Brexit, but it's more about the suspension of a democratic process.
Well, the democratic process is that the referendum result is adhered to. And that means we leave the EU with or without a deal. This is what people voted for in 2016. And the protesters today, it's very clear, actually, I was paying quite a lot of attention to who it was that was protesting. These are people that don't want to just stop a no deal. They just want to remain. And they're very small protests compared. There's certainly no overwhelming feeling in the country. In fact, the opposite's true. People I've spoken to who originally voted Remain have now spoken to me and said, well, actually, the vote was for Brexit, and so that's what we will want to see happen.
Okay,
so
well, what about that? Okay, let me get Ian back in on this. Let me get Ian back on this. Ian, your thoughts. If this had happened in another country, for example, like Iran, with the type of coverage by mainstream media, do you think it would have been the same, or how likely would it have been that such words using, for example, dictatorship and coup d'etat, we would have seen being used a lot more than it's being used right now about what's going on with the UK?
Well, I think most of the world is quite shocked because against all of the evidence, they tend to look at Britain as a fount of democracy. We know that the system is skewed and that the Queen has untold powers. There have been attempted plots of coups against Prime Minister Harold Wilson in the past, for example, historically attested to. The Queen's brother, Lord Mountbatten, her uncle, was involved in plotting against the elected Prime Minister. The point here is a referendum is quite usually and understandably the weapon of dictators, because you get one result and then you stick with it regardless of the change of circumstances. Now, just to say that we had a referendum X years ago and that we're now bound with that for eternity is a bit like saying we had an election 3 years ago and we're bound to keep that parliament in forever. Processes to deal with that. That's one of the points of representative government. And Parliament, as representing, for better or worse, the will of the British people, should be allowed to have a guiding hand on. We've had several votes in Parliament that have explicitly told the government that any deal to leave must be ratified by Parliament. We have the Speaker of the House of Commons has said that, who's called this unconstitutional. So this is way beyond remaining or Brexiting. And to preach the sanctity of a referendum several years ago that's been totally overtaken by events, because the referendum wasn't for a no-deal Brexit. It was taken under the assumption that we could negotiate a deal, and negotiate a deal on the sort of rose-coloured terms as explicitly laid out by Boris Johnson and his ilk at the time.
Okay.
Huge spending on the National Health Service. They lied to get the result. That's okay. But referendums are not eternal.
Okay, let me get Tony back in on this. Ian, stay with me. Tony, go ahead.
if Parliament wanted a deal, they should have voted for the deal that was offered to them. They don't. They just want to remain. They're not interested in actually any kind of deal or any kind of Brexit. Many of the parliamentarians are on this EU gravy train, which is when they get booted out by the voters here in Britain, they get a nice job in Brussels, and they get even put onto the European Commission, like Chris Patton, who was the chairman of the BBC as well for a while, a nice job there, and a marvellous pension for failed politicians. This is what the EU gives them. And it's not just, in the last few years that the EU has been a controversial issue in Britain. It's been ever since we joined. In 1972, it's been a controversial issue. This is why party politics would never sort this out. We had to have a referendum to lance the boil and to get a decision made one way or the other, because the individual parties are always playing politics, as we've seen. The EU really started back in around about the time of World War I with the Kalergi plan to unify Europe. Then in the 1920s, something called the Pan-European Union started in Munich, the same city as the Nazi Party was founded around about the same time. And this was basically the European aristocracy saying, we want one political centre where we can do all the lobbying and control the population of Europe, about 800 million people. Then in 1958, we had the Treaty of Rome. 1972, Britain joined the Common Market, and we had a referendum and decided to stay in Britain 3 years after we joined in 75. Then Maastricht in 1993. All these have been controversial issues. Maastricht was so controversial, it even ended up with Margaret Thatcher being booted out of office because she said, I refuse to hand over this sovereign nation to 13 unelected bankers. And then in 2000, the euro...
Well, let me just jump in here. I understand what you're saying, Tony. You're talking about non-elected officials, and of course you're talking about the Europeans, but I mean, if we concentrate on the UK itself, I mean, there would be many that would say, for example, the Queen definitely hasn't been elected by anyone, and Boris Johnson, for the most part, has not even been elected by the majority of the average Brit. Ian, your take on that?
Well, which referendum is binding for eternity? Was it the one that took us in, or the one that voted to come out? Circumstances change. That's the whole point. And if you have a government that uses that to defy its own elected representative, to defy the elected representatives, then you are really challenging the whole basis of democracy. Now, I agree that some of the people opposing who are now shouting about this are expedient, and they believe fervently in Remain. I believe less fervently in Remain, in remaining in there. But the idea that that a government, an unelected government, can force any deal, because they didn't just reject the deal, they rejected a deal that was cobbled together by Boris Johnson from a very weak negotiating position. And one of the problems here, of course, is that Boris Johnson, I think, was neutral on this issue. Boris Johnson simply wanted to be the leader of the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister, and he engineered a referendum to get that about, to unseat the existing leadership of the Conservative Party. He's achieved his ends, and he already in the past, through his lies, when he was when the Telegraph correspondent in Brussels, managed to broker a referendum in Denmark by telling absolute lies. And it's interesting, the lineup here is that we're being presented this. Unelected representatives, bankers. Margaret Thatcher opposed unelected representatives as bankers. Margaret Thatcher is the one who handed the whole country over to unelected financiers and bankers. This government is currently handing over the whole of the economy to unelected financiers and bankers.
Okay, Tony, let me give Tony an opportunity. Go ahead, Tony.
Well, look, the question really here is who rules Britain. I do a radio show here in Bristol, and one of the Brexit Party candidates put the question to some of the local politicians here and commentators saying, if you had a chance to vote again, another referendum, would you vote for the British flag and Westminster, or would you vote for the European flag and Brussels? And they both refused to answer. And that is because actually their loyalties are to international bodies. They're not interested in nationalism. They associate it, I think, wrongly with the right wing. And actually what we do need is, if we're going to have any real democracy, we need to get rid of this totally anti-democratic Brussels system, which takes absolutely no notice of what individual countries want. It tries to turn Europe into one great blancmange, all the same colour. and it is actually a United States of Europe. That's what it actually is. We're talking here about something which many people have described as a new world order, modelled on the new world in the United States. Much more convenient for these big corporations which straddle national boundaries to control all sorts of policies. What we've seen, one of the basic things we've seen in Britain, is loads of small local businesses and small local shops being closed down, and whole towns, whole cities being taken over by these massive multinational chains. So it basically squashed any opportunities for ordinary people to make their own way in the world, and the big corporations and the banksters are starting to dominate. Now, I think Boris has got a big challenge on his hands within his own Tory party, but what might well happen is we may have a financial disaster if we do leave Brexit. That's probably about time that happened, because there's an enormous debt overhang, £166 trillion, according to Mervyn King, the former governor of the Bank of England. So once that reset takes place, what we may see here in Britain is actually Jeremy Corbyn, having played quite a clever game, the leader of the opposition from the Labour Party, and the wreckage after Brexit of the economy, he may then romp home to power. So we will see then is a real socialist Prime Minister, Jeremy Corbyn, with no Brussels rules to weigh him down.
Well, Ian, now many Brits have taken to the streets denouncing what has happened. Where do you see this going? Will their voice of protest make a difference in all of this?
I believe it will. I think people are going to listen. They're going to watch. Also, there's a process in the courts. The Speaker of the House of Commons has sort of grew a spine, sometimes leapt through evolution and developed a vertebrae lately, and he has denounced this as an unconstitutional coup. I mean, there are people who are working on alternatives. It's going to be confrontational, almost certainly. Boris Johnson might well bow with the wind and say, no, not really. But in the end, this is an issue about the whether Britain is a democracy and whether the Prime Minister of any kind, and whether the Prime Minister has the right to supersede elected representatives. That's the issue at the moment. The Remain or Brexit is subsidiary in a way. It is about the sovereignty of Parliament, which has its ups and downs. And we have fought civil wars in England in Britain about the sovereignty of Parliament. If this is questioned, then if this goes ahead, I can sincerely see that the people in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland will say, well, if you English can't run a democracy, then we'll go and run our own. You can't prorogue the Scottish Parliament. You can't prorogue the Welsh Assembly.
Well, the Welsh, majority
we will take our own decisions accordingly.
Okay, go ahead, Tony.
Well, the majority of Welsh people voted to leave, as the majority of the whole country did, voted to leave. And what's happened is there's a whole load of people in Parliament who are, I mean, for example, they refuse to come on the radio programme I do here in Bristol. That almost all of the MPs have said no, because they don't want to face difficult questions about all this. Because I'm putting the point, a pro-Brexit point of view, even though it's a very balanced programme. We have a regular guest on who's anti-Brexit too, and MPs are afraid to face the difficult questions of, are they actually representing the people, or are they ploughing their own furrow for their own career, possibly in big business in the future or in the EU? So this is really a matter of sovereignty, and actually the people should be sovereign here. What's happening is many of those people that voted in 2016 have so far been betrayed because we haven't left the EU, and many of them are, of course, slowly dying off. So this is one of the reasons they want another referendum, is so that there can be, you know, several million people who voted to leave will die, and then we can have a load of young people who are easily impressionable via social media and this sort of thing, and maybe we can get another vote. This is not the way to do democracy. If there's a referendum and a clear decision from that referendum, which there was, let's just act upon it. And that's how democracy really works. And by the way, Theresa May was not elected by the Conservative Party even to be leader. She got a shoe-in because Andrea Leadsom stood down and let her take over. There was no proper vote in the Tory party. There was, though, with Boris Johnson.
All right, well, let me just get Ian back on this. I'm just about out of time. But, Ian, your perspective, what does all of this mean when we see this schism in the country? I mean, where is this going to go in your perspective?
Well, I thought that was a very interesting line. Basically, Tony's admitting that a new referendum might well reverse the decision. So what we're saying is young people, who I tend to think are more politically astute than the older Daily Mail, Sun and Murdoch press readers who voted to leave, that they have got to be bound by the views of a couple of million dead voters. That's what we're saying here. This is an interesting definition of democracy, that the youth will be tied down and their future will be trashed by people who are now heading to the crematoria and the graves. It's not a pretty sight. It's not the definition of democracy as I go it. I mean, it's the people who are alive and of voting age now who should be.
Okay, well, we definitely can continue with this conversation a while, but we're out of time. I appreciate both of you being with us here. Senior Analyst, Foreign Policy and Focus, Ian Williams, out of New York, and out of London, investigative journalist Tony Gosling.
Hi.
And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another debate. I'm Marzia Hashimi. Hope to see you next time.